Good evening. This is Mike Nichols with PMOPA. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this important safety webinar discussion, early lessons from the recent Epic E1000 accident in Steamboat Springs. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we'd love to have an interactive webinar. There is a Q&A portal. If you click on the Q&A, which should be in the center bottom of your screen, type your question in. At the end of the webinar, we'll have an opportunity to address your questions, not only on the content that Steve presents this evening during the webinar, but also on the safety brief that Kim Coriat and members of the safety community prepared and sent out to all PMOPA members this past weekend. The second item is that we are going to be able to offer wings credit for live attendees this evening. At the very end of the webinar, there will be two quiz questions. So pay attention to the webinar and then answer the questions. And David McVinney has offered to facilitate submitting the list of attendees for wings credit. So you'll get that into your wings account. If the email address that you registered for this Zoom webinar does not match your email address with your wings credit, please email me at mnichols@pmopa.com with your wings credit email address, and we'll get that reflected. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter for this evening. Excited to have Steve Thibault joining us, and he began flying at the age of 15, attended the University of North Dakota, graduated with aviation and business degrees, and it's at UND where he first began his flight instructing career. Since then, he's made the training of pilots his profession with more than 45 years of flying and more than 40 of that in flight instructing. He's accumulated over 23,000 hours of flight time with more than 21,000 hours of dual flight instruction in airplanes. That doesn't even include the simulator instruction. He's also flown over 100 different types of airplanes. He also specializes in the Piper PA-46, which is why he's with us this evening. Steve is the owner of Flight Proficiency, a flight training company, and co-owner of SimFlight Minnesota, which is a simulator company located at the Anoka County Airport. In 2015, the FAA named Steve the CFI of the Year for the Great Lakes region. He's also a founding board member of the Minnesota Pilots Association and a member of PMOPA. And for the Q&A portion, Kim Coriat will be joining us. Kimberly Coriat is the chair of PMOPA Safety Committee. I think most of you, if not all, are familiar with her excellent work that she does leading our safety initiatives at PMOPA. She had a career flying in the Air Force as well as for FedEx and owns and flies her beautiful Piper Meridian. Kim also is on the board of PMOPA and on the board of the PMOPA Safety and Education Foundation. So with that, Steve, thank you very much for putting the presentation together, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mike. And I want to thank you and Kim for the efforts you've put into this briefing that you put together. I know when I reached out to you, saying that I'd be willing to do a webinar on this accident because there's a lot of lessons to be learned. You had passed along the safety brief to me in its infancy stage, which was very, very thorough, and I was very impressed with it. It was interesting how many ideas I had to talk about were kind of the same things that were put in that safety brief. So you can't count the number of hours that you spent on that briefing. It's got to count it in days because there's a lot of information that had to be shrunk down, and did a very nice job with that.
That's all Kim who gets the credit for that. That was her.
Yes. Yep. And I also want to thank all the participants here this evening. This particular accident has a lot of lessons for us all to learn. Many of us have watched videos on this already. They're kind of almost a cookie cutter description of the accident. I'm going to try to avoid doing the same thing here tonight because I'm sure you've seen 2, 3, or 4 videos already, for many of you at least. So I'm going to approach this from a flight instructor position, or eyes and ears of a flight instructor. Based on the pilots that I train each year, I see a lot of common mistakes or misunderstandings or lack of knowledge. And I think some of that definitely has applied in this accident. I'm not here to speculate on the pilot. I'm not going to come up with causes for this accident. I'll leave that to the NTSB. My prayers go out to the family of the people that are involved. The families were turned upside down overnight, and any of our families could be the same way if we had an accident. So looking at this more from a teaching perspective, learning perspective. Hopefully you'll each get a few nuggets I can put into your bag of tricks that may pay off for you in the future. I'm going to kind of approach this a couple ways. Part of it's going to look at the chart that was flown. And I'm also going to look at this from making a flight like this myself for the first time. What kind of information am I gathering? Not just looking at charts, but digging a little bit deeper. If I were to study and prepare for this flight, my first time going into Steamboat Springs, it would have been easily minimum of 1 hour I would have spent prepping for this flight. And that's not weather, that's just understanding the airport, the approaches, the departures, and so on. So that's how I'll be coming at this. As Mike said, there'll be Q&A at the end, so you can enter questions as we go, and then Kim and I can answer questions at the end of this. We've set aside about an hour for this. We'll try to wrap it up in an hour or a little less, and then if we overflow a little bit, I'm available for as long as you need me here for questions. And if people have questions they want to contact me later about, I'm open to that as well. I'll leave my information at the end. So first off, this is a Zoom meeting here, so I'll call it a Zoominar here. I do quite a bit of Zoom training as I instruct with pilots. A lot of times I'm doing systems, POH, other items, a lot of IFR procedures. People may do a Zoom meeting with me before they do a trip. So I'm usually used to having an interaction with my single or 2 or 3 pilot audience. So here it's a little bit different where it's just me talking and I'm not going to hear your reactions. So it's just a little bit different for me. So bear with me. Okay, so let's talk about this flight. I'm not talking about the pilot on this flight. I'll state some facts that the NTSB has released on the preliminary report, and then I will get into the charts and some other items. Let's go to screen share here for you. Okay, the preliminary accident report's out. Some of you may have read it. I'm just going to state a few facts here so we're all on the same page. I'll talk about the highlighted items here. States here that the pilot was given vectors to Tilly intersection as the initial approach fix for 2 RNAV approaches going to runway 32. The wreckage is located about 3 miles south of the airport at an elevation of 8,200 feet MSL. There was a ground scar about 80 feet south of the main wreckage at about 8,175 feet. The mountain peak itself is about 8,250 feet. So you can see that this pilot was 100 feet or so below the peak of the mountain. I will also talk about, if he had cleared that mountain, that he still had many obstacles, no pun intended, but he had many obstacles or challenges ahead on that if he were to go in and land that aircraft. There was jet fuel present at the scene. The post-accident examination of the engine and airframe showed no anomalies prior to impact. They did recover some data from the G1000. It showed that the engine was producing power, the RPMs were up properly. All that was consistent with what they would expect for that phase of flight. 100 gallons of fuel remained. Waypoints were consistent with an RNAV Zulu runway 32 approach. Minimum descent altitude was 9,100 feet. The last recorded altitude for the aircraft was 8,221 feet MSL. So he was operating below the minimum descent altitude on this approach when he hit that hill. The autopilot was engaged. 4 minutes before the accident, wind was calm, visibility 10, scattered clouds reported at 500 feet, broken at 1,600, overcast 2,400 feet. So there were clouds below him reported at the airport. As we all know, this is the airport report. We don't know what he was experiencing 3 miles or 5 miles out. He could have been in clear skies. We don't know. These are just the facts here over the airport. The NOTAMs had the real lights, which are the runway end identifier lights. They were unusable for 3-2. And the PAPI lights for runway 32 were unusable. So those were in the NOTAMs. So those are the facts from that. We'll now briefly just show you the approach plate. This is the RNAV Zulu runway 32 approach. The NTSB has said the waypoints that he was flying were consistent with this. As if you looked at ADSB, it showed basically the same thing with that small little 10-degree heading change over MABKey final approach fix. I'm using, of course, the government charts here, so I'll apologize to you JEP users. I grew up on JEP for many, many years. Once 4Flight came out and the iPad was there, I switched over to the government charts, and that's what I use personally. I do have the approach plate for those with the JEPs that shows this particular approach. But most of the other information I'll be presenting will be from the government charts and their supplement. Okay, this is something I found on, or I pulled up on my iPad with 4Flight recently. This is I put a flight into Steamboat Springs. I programmed in this particular approach that I just showed you, and this graph calculated what I believe is a 3-degree glide path coming from the final approach fix down on this approach, and you can see that it flies right through the top of that hill. There's a decent chance, we don't know for sure, that it appears that the plane was probably flying down the advisory glide path. We'll get into this just a little bit later. Other than that, I'm not going to speculate on anything else that the pilot may have done or not have done on this flight. This is the same type of an image, just a little bit further out. Woodchuck is the final approach fix there, starting down. I'm sorry, that's it's just a waypoint on the approach. And then the sideways view of that from Woodchuck on in. All right, I'm going to jump ahead to a different airport to start off here. We'll come back to the Steamboat Springs, but just early lessons, I want to start with this particular approach here. If there's any pilots out there that I have trained, you probably have done this with me here in the Twin Cities. It's not too far away. It's one of my go-to airports, just 50 miles away from my home airport. It's an RNAV 32 into Burnett County. Siren, Wisconsin is the city. And this is a approach that has LNAV minimums. So it has an LNAV MDA. First thing I want to talk about is a minimum descent altitude. What I have found with training pilots is a lot of pilots don't quite understand what a minimum descent altitude is. We've been spoiled if you have WAAs. We've been spoiled with glide slopes. I love them. There are some dangers, obviously, with them if there's just the advisory one. But we're so used to intercepting a glide path with the autopilot and flying it down or hand flying it down. And MDA is a minimum descent altitude where you have to level off. You can see at the bottom of the line here, right before runway 32, there's a level off on that descent. That's the minimum descent altitude. So you cannot fly this necessarily right down to the runway if there's an advisory glide path. Now, this is just an airport just in Wisconsin. I know one of our another instructor on the forum, Mike, he's in Wisconsin. He talked about on the post on this accident, he talked about taking a pilot to a similar airport or taking his instrument students to a similar airport and showing them exact same thing I'm showing here at another Wisconsin airport. So what do I see on this approach when somebody flies this LNAV to an MDA? Well, typically it's going to come up as an LNAV plus V in the Garmin avionics. Keep in mind the plus V is just an advisory glide path. There's all kinds of warnings about that. It's not necessarily going to clear you obstacles. It typically does, but the glide path going into Steamboat Springs will not. And this airport has a similar problem. So if I'm looking at this airport for the first time coming into Siren, Wisconsin, I'm going to take a quick look at the airport diagram. And I see two things at runway 32 that, or an item at 32 that gives me a red flag on this. First off, I see, stand by here a second, pull up my marker. First thing I see here on the airport diagram is I have these squiggly lines right here. That's a displaced threshold. That's a red flag for me. Displaced thresholds typically are there because there's an obstacle on final that can be a problem. So they want to push off the landing zone a little further down the runway to clear over an obstacle. Doesn't always mean that. It could be just that the asphalt isn't proper for landing there, so they may not maintain that zone, but this is a displaced threshold for an obstacle. Next thing I see on the profile view, a couple things. We have a 3-degree glide path here. About 95% of your approaches that you fly will have a 3-degree glide path. We have a note up here though. VGSI, visual glide slope indicator. That would be a PAPI light or a VASI light system. So the PAPIs and the descent angle, the 3-degree descent angle, they don't coincide. They're different. They're not right on top of each other. Also, it says that the visual glide slope indicator has an angle of 4 degrees. So a question I like to ask pilots often is, okay, we typically fly a 3-degree final, either whether it's coming down the glide slope or coming down a PAPI light system or a VASI system. Here we have a 4-degree angle. Does that 1 degree make much of a difference? I mean, if I'm cutting a piece of wood to a 45-degree angle and I cut it to 44 degrees, that doesn't bother me. So does it bother you here? That's a 1 degree difference. And most pilots will say, no, that's not really anything to be concerned about. So then I'll pose the question a little bit differently. What if you came into an airport and they had a glide path or a PAPI system that was 33% steeper than normal? Would that raise a red flag at all? And most people would say 33% sure would. Well, that's exactly what we have here. A 1 degree angle difference here is a third steeper. And that calls for a steeper descent on final. Now, why do we have PAPIs? And if I look at my government chart, I can see the black P there. That stands for P for PAPI light system. And I'll ask a few questions. I know I can't get answers from you, but I wish I could. I wish I could see everybody answer this question. Why is that circle black? And a majority of pilots won't tell me why that's a black circle there. And if I look down at the bottom of the chart, airport diagram, I can see my reels and my MERLs, my runway end identifier lights, my medium intensity runway lighting. They have a black oval next to them. That represents pilot controlled lighting. So it's up to us to turn on the lighting. And I'll use 95% a lot when I give you statistics here, because that means a whole lot of people don't do something, or they do something. I just throw out 95%. That's kind of my number. And I'll say about 95% of the pilots that I train don't turn on these PAPI lights or activate the airport lighting when they're shooting a practice approach. I'm sure hoping they would do that when they fly a real approach. So I got to always prompt these pilots to remind them the reason for activating these lights. They're not just for nighttime. I want to break out and see a PAPI light and follow that visually down to make a safe landing. One quick story is a local airport. I had a pilot flying on an IFR day. He broke out of the clouds mid-morning, and he could not find the runway. So we went missed approach. We climbed back up, did the missed approach procedure, and we talked about why he couldn't find the runway. He never activated the lighting system. And it had snowed about a 1/4 inch of nice fluffy snow overnight, and the whole airport was blanketed with this fresh little blanket of snow. And I said, this time let's turn the lights on and come down. And then he did, and he had the PAPI lights. We briefed that they're on the left side of the runway, not the right side of the runway. And he was able then to make out the runway, and we landed at that little 1/4 inch of snow. So make sure you do turn those lights on as well. So the PAPIs here, what's going to happen on this approach is when somebody doesn't turn the PAPIs on and their plane captures the glide path, I tell them to follow that LNAV plus V advisory glide path all the way down to minimums. I want them to take it right down to the, not minimums, but to the runway. So we will fly this approach. And we follow this 3-degree path like this down to the runway. And you can see the level off there right before runway 32. It says I'm supposed to level off. If I follow that 3-degree glide path, it appears that I'm within 20 to 50 feet of some pine trees. So I force them to stay on that glide path. They all want to pull back, but I force them to stay on that glide path to show them the dangers of an LNAV plus V. And if you don't read all the notes that are here, you may have an issue by flying into something. And it might just be a foggy day where it's kind of dark and gloomy outside, and you didn't think you needed the lights turned on, and you never activated the PAPIs. So when we activate the PAPIs, if I turn them on short final, we have 2 reds. This is a 2-bar or a 2-light PAPI system, and the pilot's too low. So how do you properly fly this approach? Well, you should fly down that glide path, and we can safely fly that advisory glide path to 1440. And then I need to level off. And then I pick up the PAPI system. It's a little bit of exaggeration, of course, but I fly and I pick up the PAPI lights, and then I fly down, and that avoids these pine trees right down here that I cleared by about, at 1440, I'd be 400 feet above those pine trees. So that's what we're looking at with an LNAV plus V. We will talk about this, briefly, or we'll talk about this again with that approach going into Steamboat Springs. All right, let's talk Steamboat Springs now. We're going to go into, like I say, if I were going into Steamboat Springs for the very first time, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time studying my sectionals, my approach procedures, my departure procedures, looking for any obstacles that I can, find other than just what stands, out prominently on a chart. So whenever I have people, when we talk about flying into a new airport, especially out west or out east in the hills out there, or in the east southeast in the hills there, I always tell them, before you do anything, see if you can even get out of that airport IFR. Why do all this prep work on looking at charts on how to get in there, the approaches, if you can't fly out of their IFR and if that's your intent? Because many planes, especially if you're flying the Malibu and the Mirage, you're unable to depart these airports IFR. So first figure out that. I'm not going to talk about that tonight because we're going to focus more on the approach coming in here. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the airport here, and I see Steamboat Springs, and I look at their elevation, and we have a 6,882 foot elevation. So there we are at 6,882. I see the RP14. How many of you know what RP14 stands for? That stands for right pattern for runway 14. There's a red flag for me. There's a right pattern for it, either because there's obstacles or maybe there's noise abatement purposes. In this case, you definitely have the obstacles. The altitude, that's a red flag for me, 6,800 feet. It's called 7,000 foot elevation. Especially if you haven't operated at that altitude before. That's definitely a concern. All right, we got mountain peaks, 10.8, 10.5, out over here, just under 10,000, an 8,744 foot mountain right here. And then on the approach, we have these towers right there. That's on top of the hill for this particular approach coming in. All right. Let's look around the area. Got a couple other airports over here to the west. We have Yampa Valley, Hayden, Colorado there, 10,000 foot runway. Oops, let me go back here a second. 4,400 foot runway. It's a very short runway at 7,000 feet. 10,000 feet, not too far away if we look at the distance here. It's only 14 nautical miles. I've never driven that route before. You can tell me how long that drive is. Maybe it's an hour drive. I don't know. Maybe it's 30 minutes. So fairly straight road there, but I won't speculate too much more on how long it's going to take me to drive that. So there's an out we have. Maybe that's the best option for going into Steamboat Springs is landing over there. I know it's not convenient to go over there and make a drive, but sometimes we have to make that call on certain flights we're going to make. It's not always about convenience. Sometimes it's more about the safety part of things. I'm going to show you this little hill right here. Doesn't look like much. Doesn't really stand out on the chart. There's a lot of squiggly lines around here. A lot of squiggly lines means the terrain is changing. I'm going to show you that little one. And if I look here, that's just about, the edge of that's maybe like a little over a mile off the end of that runway. Mile and a half, we'll call it. This bigger peak over here is 5 miles roughly. So we're going to go to the airport page for Steamboat Springs, and we're going to focus up in the upper right corner of this, where we have 4 boxes up there: 3D view, FBOs, taxiways, and comments. Let's start off with a 3D view. If you have a subscription that allows us with ForeFlight, this does come in handy. There's Steamboat Springs down in the valley. I'm going to bring up runway 14. I'm going to bring up runway 32. I tilt it, I get a little better view of that. If I come on down to the runway here, there I can see my displaced threshold. I can see runway 32. And if I circle around, I can start to see some obstacles out there. At the 12 o'clock position on that picture, way out in the horizon there, that's that 8,800 foot hill, roughly 2,000 feet above the airport. That's 5 miles away. And then there's the one before that didn't really stand out in the VFR sectional, but that's only 1.5 miles or so from the runway. That definitely comes into a factor here if you're doing a circle to land. So I can zoom around this way, and there's the bigger hills. That's why we don't have right traffic for runway 14. Gives me a good view that way. I can also, if I want to dive in a little deeper, I go to Google Earth, get a much clearer, crisper picture here. Let's just drop this down below the runway and let's see what we have right before the airport. Dang, I got a pretty good little drop off right there. The winds are coming down that runway and funneling down over that hill. You might have a little bit of a downdraft on final. Now I can see that other hill that's not too far from the airport there, a little clearer. So Google Earth is wonderful. I like looking at certain airports. I might get down to the certain airports if there's some hot spots, taking a look why it's a hot spot. I can zoom right in and see all the markings and get a pretty good view of that. All right, comments. These are pilot comments. Unfortunately, all these comments are friendly comments about the FBO operators, and what a pleasure was stopping in there. Once in a while, you can pull some nuggets out of these comments if people are going to give you their red flags that they have. Watch out for this or that. Now, we used to see remarks in here as well. Those were the remarks from the airport facility directory. They're no longer found in that comments box. Rather, I have to go to the info box over here. I'm going to click on info and I'll scroll down. And there in the middle is AFD. For those like myself that maybe been flying for a while, you're familiar with the green AFD books full of information. Now we have it electronically here. So if I tap on the AFD, I will see multiple airport remarks. On the Jeppesen chart, you're going to see these on the airport diagram actually printed right on that, which is actually nice. I'm going to just call out a quick couple of notes here. Sharp drop-offs on the sides. 180-foot drop-off, 2,000 feet from the pavement. Cold temperature airport. We'll get back. We'll cover that in a little bit here. Cold temp airport. Altitude correction required at or below negative 25 C. And then straight in, not authorized to avoid traffic conflicts. So you might get some information out of those airport remarks that will pertain to your particular flight. Taxiways. This, unfortunately, is just the for-flight taxi diagram. Gives me my distance here, 4,452 feet by 100, 1,356 meters for you over in Europe, for those in Europe. And I can see my displaced threshold. Now, how long is that displaced threshold? We need to go back to the airport facilities directory, and we can look underneath the runways here. I'll put it at the very top of the screen, and I have runway 32, Tora takeoff runway available 4452, and then far to the right, LDA landing distance available 3,800 feet. So 600 feet of displaced threshold on each end of the runway. That's a short airport at that elevation. So understand your risks with those shorter runways and high elevation, especially the piston drivers. And then underneath, just up another level there, we've got runway 32. We have a PAPI, and with a glide with the angle of 4 degrees on that PAPI as well. So understand that's 33% steeper than a normal descent on final. And there's your threshold displaced at 600 feet. All right. So now I'm going to bring up the airport diagram via the procedure. So I'm going to bring up the approach chart we're talking about. This is the RNAV GPS Zulu runway 32. So it has 32 in there, so we'll have minimums. But there are 2 approaches going into 32, so they have to designate a letter to let you know that that there are multiple approaches to that same runway. Now, this is an RNAV GPS, so if you're going to some other airports, be careful because you can have an RNAV GPS to 32 and an RNAV RNP to runway 32. Those we do not do. Those are not in the Garmin database. We do have the GPS approaches available to us. So always read the title when you pull up your chart because you might be pulling up the wrong one. The airport diagram on the government chart, there's my elevation at the top, 6882 of that little box there. I can see my displaced threshold. I have PAPIs on the left side. And why is that PAPI in a black circle? Yeah, I got a few more people got it right this time. It's pilot controlled. We got to activate that ourselves. And that happens to be on the CTAF frequency. The L tells me that that's my pilot controlled lighting. There are a few airports where they will have a dedicated frequency for your pilot controlled lighting. So just verify that it's not one of those airports. It's not very common, but they can catch you by surprise. Okay, here at 3.2, we have real lights, the 2 flashing strobe lights, and high intensity lighting for runway 1432. All those are activated by the pilot. I can also see my final approach course line at 340 degrees. So there's a little bit of a dog leg I have to make to pull onto that final. While we're at that dog leg, let's go back to that airport facilities directly quickly, because there's another note in there that I failed to show you. right here. So we have the PAPIs for 3-2. So runway 3-2, the PAPIs are baffled and it's limited to 5.5 degrees left of the center line due to high terrain. So coming in on that approach, if you're on the established, you're offset already, it may be somewhat challenging to see that PAPI. I've not flown the approach. If you're on the center line, you probably won't have a problem, but if you are off a bit, that could be a possibility, or that could be a situation that could be a little bit more challenging for you to see the PAPI lights. Okay, RNAV 3-2, back to that again. Looking up at the top, we have in the notes section, this is the notes box. It's the fine print. Many pilots don't reference these notes when I see this often on training flights. The Jeppesen charts do a little bit better job of these notes because they do number them. I really like that. These are just a bunch of notes stuck together. So let's take a look at the red flags we see on these notes. So number one, we've got circle, not authorized, east of runway 1432. That's over here. I can't go that direction due to the terrain. Runway 32 helicopter visibility reduction below 1 statute mile, not authorized. You don't fly helicopters. That doesn't sound very important, but that note is typically there for helicopters because of unlit obstacles. And you do have that issue on this particular approach. Runway 32, straight in minimums, NA at night, not available at nighttime. Circling runway 32, not available at nighttime. So the question is this approach even legal to fly at nighttime? And I'll say for two reasons it is. Heck, it could say you can't land on any runway at nighttime, and I can still fly that approach maybe at nighttime, but I can't land. If I want to do a practice approach, it doesn't say I can't shoot the approach at night, but I just can't land it. But is this legal to fly with an intent for landing? Yes, it is, because what if I want to circle to runway 14? That's how that would be legal, is I fly the 3-2 approach, and then I do a circle to land, and I land on 14. With the accident that we were discussing here, I don't know what the pilot's intention was. I can't say he was going to land on 3-2. I don't know if he was going to, he might be circling to 14. I don't know what his intent was, so we won't talk about that other than saying that it's a legal approach to fly. So make sure you read all the notes on any approach you fly. I'll see airports where it says a lot of the times in these night ones, they will say not authorized at night. And again, that's usually due to obstacles that are not lit. They punch through a safety zone on the approach, and the FAA says you can't land at that runway at nighttime. So I'm thankful for FAA. They're pretty much on spot with the safety. And they try to keep us protected. So read your notes, be aware of that. Missed approach. Missed approach box. Climb to 13,600 direct to Hans and hold. Continue climb and hold to 13.6. If you get there at a lower altitude, stay in the holding pattern and climb up to 13.6 in the holding pattern. Is that a difficult missed approach? If you look at the chart where the dotted line is, it looks like a pretty straightforward missed approach here. Doesn't look all that difficult to me. Here's the holding pattern with a beautiful 8 nautical mile leg, which means if you ever end up in that holding pattern, you may not do more than one turn, but it doesn't look that hard. However, let's talk about if you're shooting this approach and you're breaking off for a circle to land. Okay, different story altogether. So let's put ourselves in a position where we're coming on the approach. And then we break off. Now this, I'm going to put the runway in blue here so it stands out a little bit more. A lot of black and white here. So the blue line I just covered right over the runway on this chart. And now let's put in our circle to land. Maybe you're right about here. You see the runway, it's daytime. You see the runway and you decide to circle. So we're going to break off for a right-hand downwind for runway 14. And then I'm going to turn over here and I'm right here. And all of a sudden a cloud deck drifts across the airport and I lose sight of the airport. I lose sight of the runway. I need to go missed approach if I lose sight of that runway. So what do? It says climb to 13,600 direct to Hans. Do I make a left turn or a right turn to Hans? Looks kind of obvious. It looks like the best thing to do is just make that left turn and join up on that missed approach going outbound. That is incorrect. That can be unsafe. You might be turning and you might be 1.5 miles final there. And if you turn away from the airport, you might be flying right into a tower or a hill or some other obstacle. So what do we do on a circle to land? Well, the rules are you turn towards the airport first, and then you proceed on that published missed approach. Not going to be a fun missed approach if you're circling and have to turn towards the airport and then turn all the way back around outbound on that missed approach. So it will look something like this. All right, missed approach, turn towards the airport, climb up in the clouds. I'm going to probably turn to like 140 degrees here, get myself over that airport, and then turn back outbound and fly that missed approach procedure. So be aware of that. If you are going to do this approach and circle, always brief beforehand how you will enter the pattern for that other runway, and B, in the event of a missed approach, how do I execute that missed approach? It's a fun maneuver to do for an instructor on a training flight. Put them on a base leg, have them do the published missed, and let them fly how they will decide to fly, which is often turning the quickest way outbound. And then that opens up a nice debrief session afterwards. Okay. Next, we'll get into this descent. Looking at the top view, we have Tilly intersection. That's the initial approach fix. They were vectored from what the the NTSB says, they were vectored for that approach. Now, why were they vectored for Tilly? Well, just to give you an understanding here, that particular aircraft came about this direction here. And then, they could have been cleared direct to Tilly, straight to Tilly. Then I will have to do the procedure turn to get turned around so I'm established inbound towards that initial approach fix. But the secret here is this. Let's draw a line perpendicular through Tilly. If I come from this area and go to Tilly, I need to do a procedure turn. That will be a parallel entry into that procedure turn. If I come from here and go to Tilly, that's going to be a teardrop entry. But if a good controller, I can tell a controller is good because they don't just, if I'm out here, they could send me to Tilly, or a controller could even ask me, and I don't know anything about the air traffic control communications on this, so I'm not going to speculate what the controller said, but what I've experienced at some other airports is a good controller will say, would you like to go to Tilly, or do you want me to vector you for a straight in? And if I say, hey, I'll take the vector for a straight in, that means they will vector me this direction here, get me across that red line, and then send me straight to Tilly so that I can come straight in on the approach. This isn't a mountain thing. This is at any airport, this may happen. So whenever a controller asks me that question, would you like to get vectored for a straight in? I'm like, this isn't a rookie controller. I know they've been around the block a few times. They understand when I have to do a procedure turn and when I can go straight in. All right, so anyway, the pilot, this particular flight approached Tilly. We have Tilly right here. We have MAB key, the final approach fix. We have Woodchuck, and we have one more missed approach waypoint, ACD. I'll call it ACD. I don't know what it is called locally, but that works for me. So we have the final fix, we have Woodchuck, and then the last one, the missed approach point. Looking at the profile view, MAB key, Woodchuck, and our final missed approach. That's our MAP, missed approach point. You can see the dotted line pulling up right there. That tells you that that's the missed approach point and you're starting your climb on the missed. And if I look at the top view, I have a dotted line going out of the missed approach here for the dotted line holding pattern. So all the dots there are representing missed approach. Okay, so this approach here prior to Tilly, we have an altitude of 12,400 feet. Can I cross Tilly at 13,000 feet? No. 12.4 is underlined and overlined. Underlined meaning the minimum altitude, and overlined meaning a top altitude, a maximum altitude. So 12.4 I got to be at crossing Tilly. So I cross Tilly, I can descend down to 10,800 feet. So when will I get my vertical glide path? When will I get my plus V? Look down here in the minimums, and just like that first approach in Burnett County, Wisconsin, I said, hey, that we have an LNAV with an MDA, a minimum descent altitude. We have to level off at that altitude. So once I come down, I need to level at 9,100 feet. Many approaches in flatlands without towers or hills or trees, I might be able to follow that LNAV plus V straight on down to that runway once I have it in sight, and it will be safe. But in other approaches like this one, it's not a safe thing to do. So let's take a look back up again. Let me clear all this out of here. When I'm approaching Tilly, I have no glide path indicator on my Garmin equipment. It's not going to show me a glide path yet. The second that the final approach fix becomes the active waypoint, I will now see LNAV plus V pop up if that's what's going to happen. It will happen right here as it switches over to MAB key. And then I should see a glide path. And I can follow that advisory glide path down to 10,800 feet. This is the tricky part on this approach, though, is this. Let's take a look at the distances. I have 4 miles from MAB key to Woodchuck, 5 miles after that, and another half mile to the runway. Wow, that's 10 miles out. Most final approach fixes, 95% of them, are going to be about a 5-mile final. This is out there at 10 miles. It's not uncommon to see that out west. So if I hop on that LNAV plus V and my autopilot's flying me down, or I'm hand flying, I can follow that glide path down to 9,100, and then I have to level off. That glide path, the LNAV plus V, is going to look like this. But just like that Burnett County, Wisconsin, where I have pine trees, I need to briefly level off there. Literally, it might be a 3-second level off to pick up the poppies. Here, holy crap, I'm up at 9,100 feet. I'm airport elevation, 6,900 feet. I'm 2,200 feet above the airport. So I can't follow the glide path down there. I need to level off. And because look at this, I have a visual segment here. Visual segment means that when I go visual, when I'm at 9,100 feet and I decide to go below 9,100 feet, I have to have my airport in sight. When can I go below the MDA? When can I go below 9,100 feet? 3 things must be met. To go below the MDA or to go below a decision height, I need 3 things to be met by the FARs. I need to have the runway environment in sight. And to break it down, there's like 10 things. I'll break it down to 2. You need the physical runway itself and all the markings on it, all the paint markings on it, or you need the lights for that runway. You can read the whole list, runway lights, centerline lights, PAPI lights, but it's basically the runway or the lights for that runway. So I need to have that in sight. I need to be able to descend at a normal rate to land, and I need the visibility that's shown on the chart. I need to have at least 1.25 mile flight visibility. That's from my eyeballs looking out the front window. I need to be able to say, hey, my eyes can see at 1.25 miles. So daytime, you break out and you're at 9,100 feet and the clouds are above you. You can see the airport. You can see Mount Emerald or Quarry Mountain. There's 2 names for that, from what I gather. You could see that obstacle and avoid it visually. Daytime, totally different approach. Not saying it doesn't have its own challenges when you're 2,200 feet high, especially when that hill's sitting right about here. So if you're to try to do a straight in during the day, you got a pretty steep descent to make. If you circle, you've got a little bit more time to lose altitude. So remember, 9,100 feet, the glide path, I'm going to emphasize one last time here. Put it in yellow this time. That LNAV plus V, the Garmin glide path, is going to put me on a 3-degree path like this, and it's going to take me down. But I have to stop at the MDA unless I have that airport in sight. So let's just take a look at this from a difference. I've been saying daytime, nighttime. Man, if I'm at 9,100 feet and I see that airport, I can't see the mountains. Maybe there's a full moon out there I can, but there's obstacles out there that are invisible to you. Whether you're going straight in or landing. Now, we can't land on 3-2 here, so the only legal way we can do this is land on 1-4. But let's take a situation where you break out much earlier. Maybe you're able to cancel IFR, so now you're just VFR. Understand the risks when you do that is if you don't understand that you still got to fly this properly to avoid the obstacles, it could end up in the same outcome. All right, a couple more things. Categories. Category A, Category B. How do I know what category I'm in? Well, I need to go into my documents here and take a peek at. So this is I'm looking at right here is the Digital Terminal Procedure Supplement. If you ever started flying with the government charts with paper books, you may recall that in the front of that paper book and in the back of that paper book, you had all kinds of information in there. How to read the charts properly, circle of land radius, category A's and B's and C's and D's, and many other bits of information. Well, digitally, we have it all put into this document here that you can put into ForeFlight documents. You can pull it out of the FA. It's very easy to do and load it into your documents. And we have right here a maneuvering table. Category A. Whoa, excuse me there. Category A is 0 to 90 knots. Category B is 91 to 120. That's based on your power off stall speed landing configuration. Our PA-46s fall into category A. If you are maneuvering at a faster speed, we must go to that speed. If I'm circling at 110 knots, I'm a category B aircraft at that point. So we do fall into two categories depending on your speed. We're actually a category aircraft, but you will have to bump it up if you're going faster than 90 knots. Circling. If we look up in the notes section, we have the snowflake, negative 25 Celsius. This is relatively new. It's been around for a while, but it hasn't always been there. So many pilots have never used this before. It's telling you that you may need to make, or you shall make, an altitude correction on this chart if the temperature is colder than negative 25 Celsius. Okay, well, how do I use this? Well, I go into my documents, again, that same supplement. And we have a cold weather, cold temperature error table chart. On the far left, you have temperatures from plus 10 to negative 50. And then the row across the top is height above the airport in feet, from 200 feet to 4,000 feet. So if I look at it says it showed negative 25. So over on the side, I have a negative 10 and a negative 20 temperature. If I look at my minimums of 9,100 feet, that's 2,200 feet above the airport. Let's just go over to the column that says 2,000. So I have 2,000 feet minus 25 right in the middle there. And I'm going to interpolate between 280 and 380. If it's negative 25 degrees outside, I would add 330 feet to my minimums. Instead of 9,100 feet, I would change that to read 9,430. There is a whole section in the AIM on this, and that's in chapter 7 of your AIM. If you want to read more details, they give you a little bit more information up here, but you need to make an adjustment. If you're shooting an ILS down to 200 feet on that same cold day, let's just say negative 25, say they had an ILS here, I would actually add 35 feet to my minimum altitude. Now, 35 feet when you're up at 3,000 feet above the ground is nothing, but 35 feet when you're coming down to 200 feet, that's a big number. I'm going to add that on there. And one thing I can respect is, as an instructor, I watch people flying down to 200 feet all the time, and it never phases me that, or it always amazes me, I will say, how low we actually are above the ground. It's impressive. Something I didn't really understand when I was doing this as a student, that 200 feet's darn low. I knew it was low, but it's a whole lot lower when you're watching someone else flying it down there. So if you're flying this approach at negative 25, we must add that factor in of 330 feet. Now, this particular day of this accident, it might have been 0 to negative 5. So if I do the same interpolation with those temps, it's going to be about 160 feet I should add. So if I look at the approach plate, excuse me. If I look at the approach plate, I would be doing this. I'd be changing my numbers here. 9260. I'm coming in, I'm going to level off at 9260. Now that's still, when I look at the obstacles here, I'm coming right over this tower at 83.53. So on a warm day, if I'm down at 9,100 feet, I'm 800 feet above that tower. Which again, if I'm looking outside as an instructor, that tower looks darn close to me when I'm even 700 feet over the top of it. But if I did not make a correction on that 25-degree day, I would be 160 feet closer to that. I'm starting to chip away at my safety margins here. Now, can I add anything on a 0-degree day or -5-degree day? Well, it says -25, but you could still take that table, interpolate that, and say, hey, it's a 160-foot difference. And I could just simply take my minimums on that -5-degree day, and I can say the 9260 here. I can add that number right to it. So feel free to do that. I mean, you can set personal minimums for yourself. That's all up to you. I can add that number to that value if I want to. I could do it out here if I wanted to. I could say 11,860. Let's call it 11,900. I'm sorry. Call it 12,000 feet. I would, if I need to tell the controller that, sometimes I may need to tell the controller that, hey, I'm going to be, due to cold air, I'm going to come in there. But I don't have to because it's warmer than -25. But you can still put in these factors if you want to be extra safe. If you're going to that final fix, tell the controller. Especially if they've cleared you down to say like a 10.8 and you're going to be a little bit higher. So that's a cold weather temperature chart. Back to that document there, we have our circle to land table here. We have circling radius. And note the 9 on the left side here, we have 9,001 feet and above. The circle altitude on this approach is 9,100. And if I look at a Category B aircraft, 2.1 miles. I have a 2.1 mile radius around that airport to circle. And that's so remember what I showed you early on. There's that hill out there about a mile and a half away that's sticking up 500 feet above the airport elevation. Man, I can be circling out there at 2 miles if I wanted to. You could really be skimming some obstacles out there if you're not aware of their presence there. So look at this airport. It's very dangerous in my mind if I'm circling at nighttime. It's a dangerous airport just in general if I'm coming in there at nighttime. All right, on the Jeppesen chart. They show this descent angle, 3.77 degrees. Man, if I follow that down, I can be right into that hill. But note how Jeppesen, I really like the way they depict this, where they show like a hard level off there, unlike I see on the government charts. It comes down, boom, level off until the missed approach point. Once I see the runway, I got to be visual. I can descend below that. If it's nighttime and I see the runway over the top of Woodchuck, I still have that mountain in front of me. So I got to understand where those obstacles are, and I can't see them at nighttime. So I'm not going into this airport IFR at night. I've been flying a long time, and I would not find myself coming into this airport in these conditions. So there's a lot of risks out there that many pilots don't understand because they're not aware of those risks. So sometimes you can get trapped with these charts with a nice dotted line going right down to the runway, thinking that that's going to be okay. But remember the rules to get below MDA. And I have my MDA right here. LNAV, 9,100 feet. To descend below that, I have to have the airport, the runway in sight. I need the visibility, and I got to be able to make a safe, consistent descent and maneuvering. Getting up on our hour, just over an hour, so I'm going to start wrapping this up. See if there's anything else I want to talk about that chart for a second. Nope. So let's go to all right. I'm going to review a couple things here. Mike mentioned there's a quiz at the end of this. You didn't know, maybe you didn't know coming into here, there's a quiz in the webinar, but there is a quiz. I meant to bring this one up earlier. I did talk about this. So when the Garmin avionics display LNAV plus V, the glide path is only an advisory glide path, and it does not guarantee obstacle clearance. Cannot stress that enough. The LNAV plus V, you got to be careful. If there's a step down fix on an approach, the glide path might put you down through too close to an obstacle. It might not put you into the obstacle, but might put you within 200, less than 250 feet above that obstacle. So be careful on that. So the glide path, the Garmin avionics LNAV plus V, the glide path is only an advisory glide path. Doesn't guarantee obstacle clearance. All right. Last thing I want to leave you with right here is just some tips. I give these tips to pilots I train, especially if they're transitioning into a new aircraft. If they have new avionics, that can be a new GPS, it can be a new glass PFD, it can be a new autopilot, any new avionics. Or if you're just fresh off your instrument rating, lower time, there's a couple tips I give these pilots. I say, I want you to be flying approaches. 80% of the time you fly an approach. Fly them 100% if you can, but just fly approaches, fly approaches, fly approaches. Usually it doesn't add more than a couple minutes to a flight. All you need to do is when that controller says expect the visual approach for RNAV 36 approach, is key the mic and say, I'd like to do, clear for the visual approach at, I'll say it, Anoka County Airport. You come back and just simply say, I'd like to do the RNAV 27 approach. They have no problem giving you that approach. And then they will vector you or they'll send you to initial fix and fly the approach. If you're going into a new airport, I don't care how much experience they have. If I'm going into a new airport, especially it's nighttime, give me an approach. Line me up on the correct runway. It's so simple to do that. The really experienced pilots do a lot of approaches. You know, because we learned that it's much easier just to come in on a glide path and come on down. And the more you do these approaches, the more you're going to learn about your GPS, your autopilot, air traffic control instructions, and approach procedures. And maybe you're going to learn and you're going to make mistakes. Well, man, if I make a mistake and it's VFR outside, that's the time to make the mistake. Those usually aren't too deadly. But if you want to be like the typical pilot and only fly approaches when it's IFR or when ATC says expect the blank approach, you're not going to get many approaches in a year's time. Most pilots get about 10% of their flight time is IFR. Look at your logbook. If you got 1,000 hours, typically you may have about 100 hours of IFR time in, actual IFR in. So we don't get a lot of actual approaches in. If you wait until just doing approaches at those moments, you're leaving a lot of valuable lessons on the table there by not doing them when it's VFR. So fly approaches, fly approaches. I had one of my clients, he came in one year. I had told him, I said, hey, I want you to shoot as many approaches as you possibly can. And you'll be amazed at what you're going to learn from communications to the other things I told you. And a year later, he came back and he says, hey, Steve, I did what you told me to do last year. And I said, well, what did I tell you again? I forget. He says, you told me to shoot approaches. He says, I did. I've done that this year. He says, I cannot believe how much I've learned this past year about IFR flying, specifically with approaches. And then also with my autopilot, he said, my avionics, my GPS. Do approaches, do approaches, do approaches. That's one of the biggest tips I can give to pilots. So I'm going to leave it at that. Remember, there's a 2-question quiz afterwards. I'm telling you to do approaches as often as you can. Fly an approach as often as you can on every flight. And I'm also reminding you that the LNAV plus V is glide path advisory only, no guarantee of obstacle clearance. So at that, I'll end it here. There's about another 2 hours I can talk about this. I'll leave it at that, and we'll go into our Q&A session. And actually, before I do that, I'll just leave up my info. If anybody wants to reach out to me, feel free to contact me. Happy to answer any questions you may have off this after this webinar or in the future here.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. That was incredibly detailed and informative, just what we were hoping for. Greatly appreciate all of that briefing for us. I did bring up the poll questions, so you should see them on your screen now. You can do them one at a time, answer the questions. And if you're not sure of what the answers were, that means you weren't paying attention. Can you see the poll questions on your screen? There we go. So choose the answer. All right, people are answering the questions. They're just 2 questions, and so far, everybody's getting them correct. But I'll leave this open because you have to answer the questions in order to get the wings credit. So we'll just give it a few moments and can answer those questions while we're going to dive into the Q&A. So Steve, you asked a question about how long of a drive it is from Hayden Airport to Steamboat Springs. One person said it's about a 30-minute drive. Another person probably drives like me. They said it's about a 20 to 25-minute drive.
All right. How about for the snow on the ground?
Right. So the first question is, it says the JEP chart has a note of 34/1 not clear, that's in quotes, while the FAA chart does not. What does that note mean is the first question. And then there's a second one to follow.
Yeah, a very simple answer to that is there's an obstacle that's going to be penetrating a 3-degree angle roughly. So that's why the government chart has visual segment obstacles. That's my red flag. And the Jeppesen 34/1, that means the same thing. So either one of those is going to tell you there's some obstacle penetrating a safe zone, and typically about a 3-degree angle is punching through it.
Fantastic, thanks. Next question is the JEP chart also shows a descent angle in the profile view of 3.77 degrees, while the FAA chart does not show a descent angle. Does showing a descent angle imply obstacle clearance?
Kim?
No. All it is drawing a line from one point to another.
So there's a couple of gotchas on both sets of charts.
Yeah.
That can lead you down the wrong path.
And then the final question from this attendee is, why aren't the notes in profile view identical on the 2 charts? Guess that might be a question for Jeppesen.
Yeah, I think that's a publisher's choice.
Yeah.
And that's why they copyright their plates.
All right. Next person asks, with a fully up-to-date Garmin panel, is it possible to fly an LNAV approach using VNAV to dive and drive rather than following the plus V? Would that prevent the autopilot from following the plus V below MDA, assuming VNAV is set up correctly? And then the person's not sure if this would be possible in approach mode. They may have to use NAV plus VNAV.
NAV plus VNAV, and set the MDA as your altitude.
In many autopilots also, if you are coming down on approach mode, down to a decision altitude, is if you do pre-select an altitude, it'll fly right through that. It ignores that, and with most autopilots.
Great, thank you. Next question. Doesn't the compensation table only apply at and below the published temperature?
Legally, yes. If you want to invoke physics, no. And the reason is that there's a minimum uh, required obstacle clearance in the final segment that's 250 feet. And that minus 25, if you take a look at it, it winds up being where it wipes out that complete 250 feet. So if you're like, say, minus 20, legally you don't have to do it. In reality, geometry-wise, you're going to just be clearing that obstacle just by a few feet. So if you're just even slightly low, you could hit it.
Yeah, so legally it says you must use this at negative 25 on this chart. So yes, by all means. But as I pointed out too, if you want to adjust 9,100 feet, that's the minimum descent altitude. So that's your I mean, you can do, I can say, hey, my personal minimum is only going to be 9,700 feet on this approach. And I can level off legally at 9,700 feet. So if I'm adjusting that up by 160 feet on a 0 to -5 day, I see absolutely, there's nothing illegal about that and nothing wrong. If I'm going to change that at the final approach fix, then I may have to call ATC on that one and say, hey, I want to level off a little higher because of the cold temperatures. And they can say, that's fine. And then they have no issues there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Given the chart notes, you need to circle to land. Doesn't that mean you can't descend below MDA until 2.1 nautical miles?
So your protected area is 2.1 miles, correct. So if we don't look at that, and again, if a pilot just breaks out and sees the airport, they might say, oh, I'm good to go. I'm going to drop on down. So it's very important to understand those circle radiuses for your speeds that you're operating at. If in that situation, if they leveled off at 9,100 feet, or if you level off at 9,100 feet and stay there until 2.1 and then start down, you're in the protected ring now. But again, that's all 9,100 feet, that whole protected area, in 2.1 miles. So you got other obstacles that you got to deal with that are lower there, as I pointed out, with some of those unmarked hills.
Thank you. Next question. Is TAWS inhibited when autopilot has captured a glide path?
That one, I'm not going to answer that one because I don't know if the different avionics now and how many of them will be inhibited and how many will not be. So hopefully your manual will tell you that on the different models.
I think that's a fair answer. Next one is the minus 25°C temp threshold. Is it according to outside air temperature probe or reported temperatures, for instance, ATIS?
So that's going to be airport temp. So I'll say the AWAS ATIS. That'd be a correct one.
Thank you. On a Garmin 1000 or 3000, what pilot actions will cause the aircraft to descend below MDA?
Well, if you have, I'm going to say if you have typically in most packages, if you are coming down on an approach on a glide path, it will fly right through the MDA with no level off at 9,100, let's say. But if you were coming down on a glide path, using vertical speed and pre-programming altitude 9,100, it should capture the 9,100.
Great, thank you. Next one, in the G1000, you can add the outside temperature and the altitude will be automatically adjusted. This is more of a comment than a question.
Can you say that again?
In the G1000, you can add the outside temperature and the altitude will be automatically adjusted. It's a comment, not a question.
Okay.
All right. Next, approach speeds into busy airports. ATC has asked the aircraft to keep the speed up. This one person says he was asked to maintain 200 knots to the initial fix, then 170 to the final approach fix. Thoughts or suggestions?
Sure. Tell them what you want to do. If you can do that, fantastic. Tell them I can do that. If you can't, you speak up. One of my favorite talks I ever heard was by a local controller here in the Minneapolis approach. He's a pilot as well, funny guy. all kinds of humor in his talks. And he got up on stage and he brought up some pilot and says, "Hey, what are you flying for instruments?" Skyhawk, right? Yeah, yeah. "What approach speed do you use?" 90 knots. He says, "Okay, you can come into Minneapolis." And I might say, "Hey, can you do 100 knots for me on this approach?" "Yes." "Can you do?" And he might say, "Well, I got a bigger airliner coming in. Can you do 110?" And he keeps ratcheting it up. And his point was, I've just talked this pilot into doing 180 knots down the glide slope on a Skyhawk. And he says, "You guys got to just tell me when to say no, because I'll keep asking. And you tell me when no." So we have to know what our safe numbers are, what we want to do it at. And maybe that means you get vectored out and you got to come in, 10 minutes later. But you speak up for yourself. Never be shy to say unable, and never be shy to tell them what you can do or can't do.
Thank you. Excuse me 1 second. Next one is a comment. Again, somebody providing some information. It says, you can fly LNAV with VNAV, but, and emphasizing the but, Garmin will only fly VNAV to the last step down before the final descent to minimums. You need to manually fly to minimums, either with pitch, vertical speed, or the FLC if IAS. Usually we all descend using vertical speed. Any response to that comment?
No, a lot packed in there. I kind of
All right.
need you to read it again a couple times for me to take it all in.
Okay. Next one. If your system provides a GPS WASP-based altitude, would it be safe to dive and drive using the GPS altitude difference added to the barometric altitude setting for the different fixed altitudes in MDA?
That was a long one also. I got to see that one to read it and get it factually right.
I think if you click on the Q&A in this bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see these as a presenter. Are you able to see it?
Finding it here.
Should be under the open questions, should be at the top by the initials BL.
Okay. I'm going to skip on that one right now. I'm not wrapping my head around that just yet.
Okay. Yep. Thanks. Next one. Just to be clear, with an LNAV plus V and a Garmin autopilot in approach mode, since this is a virtual glide path, descent will be limited to the altitude set. In this case, it should have been set to 9,100. This, of course, is not so in an LPV after the final fix.
Many autopilots will fly right through that glide path, or I'm sorry, right through that 9,100 foot if you're coming down a glide path.
Yeah. So I guess their comment is about the Garmin autopilot in approach mode specifically.
Yeah.
So, yep. Okay. So then circling back to another comment the person asked, so we need to watch and punch altitude to stop the descent?
Many autopilots will not let you level off coming down a glide path either when you hit altitude. So what I recommend to people is with your own autopilot, try it next time. On a VFR day, shoot an approach back into your home airport. And at pattern altitude, let's say maybe you're going to circle to a different runway, just hit the altitude on it and see if it levels off. A lot of them will not.
Yeah, another great thing to do on a VFR day.
Yeah. Again, fly approaches, fly approaches, fly approaches. You learn so much about your equipment.
Those are some great questions and comments, and that brings us to the end. Steve, when you and I talked about this, we said we'd publish the time from 7 to 8 o'clock, but we expected there'd probably be some good Q&A, and we'd probably go to close to 8:30, and that's exactly what we did. So for those who hung in to the very end, greatly appreciate everybody's engagement and participation tonight. I think this is an incredibly valuable webinar. If you would like to see more accident reviews as webinars that PMOPA offers, please let me know, and we'll be happy to work with members of the safety community and our flight instructor community to put on more very educational, informative webinars just like this one. Kim, thank you very much for being here, for helping to answer with the Q&A. And Steve, excellent webinar presentation. Appreciate all of the work you did to put this together and share these best practices. We all can be smarter, better instrument pilots. Thank you
Mike.
all. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.